What if the person you loved more than anyone was permanently changed by dementia, and you became their caregiver? Well, your relationship would change. You would change too. My name is Aaron, and I'm currently full-time caregiver for Diane, my wife of nearly 30 years. She's living with advanced Lewy body disease. I started the Diane Project to tell stories about our journey. Some stories are about the past, some are about the here and now. I hope you get something from them. Today, I'll be reading a story I originally posted to Substack on January 16, 2025, titled, "This is the Kiss Test." It's been adapted for audio. If you like this, please subscribe where you get your podcasts. I also publish a newsletter with bonus content. You can subscribe at thedianeproject.com. I suppose I should share a little bit about what Diane has and what stage we're at with her disease. I didn't want to do that right out of the gate because the Diane Project is more about the care than the illness. Besides, the interesting thing about Diane isn't what she has, but who she is. When I'm in the room with her, I feel like she's in a liminal space where cognition isn't required. She's quiet, but doesn't seem bored. Sometimes she talks to visions I can't see. Spiritually and emotionally, I sense that she's all there. And then when family or friends drop by, I feel like the owner of Michigan J. Frog, watching his pet burst into song. Visitors bring out a lively and talkative side to my bride. Diane's former neighbor and work colleague, Sue Ellis, paid us a visit in November. Now, Diane no longer remembers working on textbooks in the 80s and 90s, but she was delighted that Sue dropped by. Diane has Lewy body disease. It's also known as Lewy body dementia and dementia with Lewy bodies. I'll refer to it as LBD or Lewy. It's been known to medical science almost as long as Alzheimer's disease, but has not been studied nearly as much. Here are some fun facts about Lewy. It's like having Parkinson's and dementia. LBD involves a certain kind of protein deposit on the brain. LBD is probably the second most common form of dementia. I say probably because there are 3 different diseases, all claiming to be the most common form of dementia after Alzheimer's. Of these 3, Lewy is the most complex, having fooled a lot of neurologists over the years. As diagnostic mastery of LBD spreads, the number of reported cases will go up. Already, more than 1 million Americans are known to be living with Lewy. That's compared to 5+ million with Alzheimer's. LBD was long misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Now, why does this matter? Because there are meds you can take that help slow the effects of Lewy. And there are drugs to definitely avoid when you have Lewy. Also, just think about what kind of torture it would be to have a loved one experiencing symptoms that didn't line up with what the doctor was telling you. We're fortunate that our neurologist did his residency at Mayo Clinic, which is an LBD center of excellence, and he knew what to look for. There's no cure for LBD. There are some promising signs, though, like tests that will detect Lewy biomarkers in a person before they're symptomatic. I know one reader of the Diane Project who has benefited from this testing. The so-called survival rate for most people after being diagnosed with LBD is 5 to 7 years, though personally I know several folks who have lived much longer. So that's your Lewy 101. For many LBD caregivers, these medical facts are not that relevant. In fact, in my experience, neuroscience has little to offer the cognitive caregiver other than a diagnosis. Last week, we had our first neurology appointment in 14 months, and I only did that to get one of her prescriptions renewed. At least we were able to have a video visit. More helpful are the monthly house visits from a nurse practitioner who works for a local palliative care provider. She takes Diane's vitals, asks if there have been any changes, any falls, that kind of thing. She's focused on Diane's well-being. Because her agency also handles hospice care, it's a load off my mind knowing that someone with experience will be there when it's time to transition. Really, though, the only person who truly understands caring for someone with LBD day to day is another caregiver. As it happens, one of the very few in-person groups of Lewy caregivers in the whole Midwest meets once a month at a pie shop about 3 blocks from my house. Yes, I belong to both a soup club and a pie group. If anyone would like to invite me to their sandwich league or their quiche society, you know where to find me. This pie group formed out of a Chicago-based Zoom call that I joined shortly after the diagnosis in 2020. Made up of the wives of men with Lewy, plus me, our group brings several decades of combined caregiving to the table. These ladies will be the first to point out that if you've met a person with LBD, you've met one person with LBD. Everyone in the group knows just what a screwball disorder this is. No 2 cases are the same. Some people with Lewy are immobile, while others go to the gym for rock-steady boxing. Some hallucinate happy creatures. Others hallucinate monsters. Many don't hallucinate at all. And every now and then, you get the retired, dutiful employee who slips out of bed at 4 a.m. and drives downtown because they're late for a meeting. Our experiences are different, but our journey is the same, and our community is like no other. Much of the essential guidance I've gotten has come from this group, listening to their stories and sharing mine. I remember when I was debating whether to hire my first aide and telling the ladies that I wasn't sure that I needed one. After all, I had spent years being around Diane 24/7. One of them sweetly smiled at me and said, "That's because you're in denial." She wasn't wrong. The 4th anniversary of Diane's diagnosis was last month, so I decided to look back to see how her disease had progressed. There are 2 widely used dementia staging systems. FAST is a 1 to 7 scale based on common symptoms. DSRS is a survey that scores the patient on 12 different categories, including memory, social activity, and personal care. I used these systems 2 years ago and determined that Diane was in moderate to severe dementia. Today, according to both measurements, she's right where she was 2 years ago, which makes no sense. Even from my too close perspective, she's obviously undergone many changes since then. So I called Pat Snyder, a former LBD caregiver who now coaches and teaches other caregivers. She spent the better part of a decade on the Lewy journey with her husband John, keeping him in such good trim that their neurologist, Dr. Daniel Coffer, encouraged her to write a book. That resulted in Treasures in the Darkness, extending the early stage of Lewy body dementia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease, as well as a new vocation for Pat. She leads a monthly caregiving class in Wake Forest, North Carolina, that she repeats on Zoom and YouTube. Pat was named the 2019 Lewy Body Dementia Association Volunteer of the Year.
You can't stage this disease. It's too much of a roller coaster.
Pat told me.
The experts that I respect the most, I hear them saying it's generally early, middle, late. That's about as good as you're going to get with LBD.
While Alzheimer's is a predictable, mappable disease, Lewy symptoms come and go, fluctuating and baffling everyone around the patient.
You can be at early stage one day, and it seems to be late stage, and then back at early or somewhere in the middle, and you never can tell exactly on any given day where you're going to be.
What I love about Pat is her positive attitude and her belief that resilience and hope are muscles that can be developed. Above all, she helps caregivers to become more proactive, whether outfitting their bathrooms or coping with stress and grief. I called Pat because of something she said during a presentation at the Dr. Daniel Coffer Memorial Caregiver Conference in 2023. She says it during almost every talk she gives, and it was like a lamp I could carry into the cave of advancing Louie. LBD patients will likely know their loved ones on the day they leave the earth.
They will likely know you at the end, so create as many moments of joy as you can.
Pat began our conversation by telling me a story about her husband, and instead of the familiar roller coaster analogy, she used a different image, one that I found both helpful and deeply moving.
He would go into this sleep things where he would sleep for 3 days almost nonstop. And I would literally at times had a syringe that I used when I fed the kids baby food, and I would be syringing water and kind of wake him up enough and syringe water in to get some fluid into his body. And that's all he was taking in over a 3-day period, maybe a little applesauce. And then he'd bounce right back. And
Yep.
the caregivers were like, oh yeah, this is what happens at the end. This is what happens. But that went on for months and months and months and months. I just got to the point that I just kind of floated with it. You just float. You're in the stream and you're just floating down the stream. And you don't know what's coming. And you eventually, over time, you learn not to let that rattle you the way it did earlier.
Wow. Yes, exactly. As John's disease progressed, Pat developed a strategy that she now advises all her caregivers to try. She calls it personifying the disease. You separate the disease from your loved one, give it a name, Louie is good, and treat it as an adversary, one that can be outsmarted and outmaneuvered.
When there's any what I call ugly behavior, you have paranoia, anger, suspicious behavior, anything that's just nasty behavior, you just automatically go, oh, that's Louie. What's my job with Louie? Outsmart him. So if I saw that look on John's face when I came in the room, I go, oh, I forgot something, be right back. I just get out of there. Don't feed the monster. You don't give the monster any attention at all. By getting out of the room, there's a reset.
In the early years of her illness, if Diane got upset, confused, aggressive for seemingly no reason, I would push back. This never worked. It just hurt my wife's feelings. Pat's insight was to see her loved one as entirely blameless and Louie as the troublemaker who has stopped by their house. As a female caregiver dealing with a larger, more imposing man, Pat may have had a keener sense of her own helplessness, and that led to the creative approach of personifying Louie. It took me longer to get to that awareness. In the early post-diagnosis stage, I was under the illusion that Diane's disease could be managed in the same way that we had managed previous health challenges. Then the Louie body roller coaster started up, and what followed felt like a non-stop parade of changes that were not only stressful and unpredictable, but had a habit of exposing my shortcomings. After a lifetime of relying on my wits, humor, and occasional temper, I was confronted with an adversary that was immune to my cognitive charms. It took time, but eventually I was able to develop a kind of jujitsu with Louie. When it's coming on strong, I need to give way. Aggression is met with tenderness. Pat's image of this stage as floating downriver is perfect. I've had to learn to accept what's out of my control and to gently navigate the current as I wait for my loving spouse to float back into view.
One of the things I love to say to caregivers, because I found it to be so true, if you've given this your best shot, and nobody does it perfectly ever, 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 but if you've given this a good shot, you're going to like yourself better at the end of it because you have learned something about love you probably could not have learned in any other way. And you're going to be able to love more deeply, have much more compassion because you had to. You just had to.
A few weeks ago, I made a delightful discovery while tucking Diane into bed. Our routine is the same every night. I brush and floss her teeth, give her a few pills, change her into pajamas. In bed, I get her flat on her back and pull up the covers. Then I turn off the light, sit next to the bed, and gently rub her head. I don't know the science behind this, and don't really care, but it seems that the surface of the skull, right above one of the most damaged parts of her brain, is now the source of her greatest tactile pleasure. Many times she'll go slack-jawed or fall asleep while I'm rubbing her temples. I keep this up until my arm gets tired. Then I'll lean in to give her a kiss. One night I switched the order around, rubbing her head and then turning off the light. Coming back to the bed, I leaned in very slowly, not yet able to see her face in the dark. As I got close to her lips, so close that I could feel her chin, I heard her smooching the air. And I was struck by a flashback. Hundreds of mornings and evenings, Diane would throw me this same air kiss. Lying in bed, me leaning in, her eyes closed, but sensing my nearness, her lips reaching out. It didn't matter if we actually kissed. For 30 years, this was our secret act of ordinary intimacy, and I didn't realize how much I missed it until that moment, when it popped out of the liminal space, where cognition isn't required. The next day, I leaned in again, eager to repeat the magic, but she wasn't having it. Undaunted, I tried again later, and that time, I got a smooch. It was thrilling, almost like a first kiss. So I started doing it every day, the kiss test. She doesn't know it's a test, of course, but she's not the one being tested. I am. I feel I have to earn it. I can't just swoop down and get a smooch on demand. No, like any lover, I have to get her in the mood. And that's challenging when Louie is in the room. One evening after supper, I noticed her becoming preoccupied with this hallucination. She began talking past me to a vision across the room. I asked her what was going on, which was silly because she can't explain things. So I just let her go on for a while, and I listened as the anxiety in her voice continued to build. Finally, I took her hands, looked her in the eye, and said emphatically that I loved her and that I wasn't going anywhere. It was just her and me in our home, and we were safe. That did it. She fell silent. I sat with her, grateful that my abracadabra had actually worked. Later, as I tucked her into bed, I began my routine, rubbing her head, and then, in response to a low hum of pleasure, I moved down her body, making little sparks in the dark as I rubbed her chest and legs over the covers. And lo, a spring of clear words suddenly flowed out. "It was a great day," she said happily, "if you have the right attitude." She smooched the air. Then she was out. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit me over at thedianeproject.com. Take care.